Sarah O'Sullivan, and I serve the Boston College Cloud School of Theology and Ministry as Assistant Director of Continuing Education. Thanks to each of you for joining us today for our second lecture in our Fall 22 Continuing Education lecture series. As part of the school's mission, we offer an array of enrichment opportunities to foster Christian faith and promote lifelong learning. We do this with on-campus presentations like this one, as well as online courses, webinars, videos, and other resources for personal enrichment and professional development. Our next several CSTM online Crossroad courses begin October 16th. Courses include Gospel of Luke, which explores the gospel setting, the evangelist who wrote it, and the community for which it was written. One of our other courses starting on October 16th is Effective Preaching, Homily Preparation. This course is designed for ordained and lay preachers to explore how to craft an engaging homily and to share tips on how to cultivate the habits needed to compose and deliver weekly homilies. More information on these and all of our courses is available by visiting bc.edu/crossroads. Don't miss your opportunity to enroll. Our fall calendar of lectures is detailed in this flyer, which is available at the entrance, as well as visiting our website at bc.edu/CSTMCE. You'll see we have a number of additional lectures this semester, and I'll just briefly highlight the next two. Next Thursday, October 10th, Sam Sawyer, Editor-in-Chief of American Media, will join us From Polarization to Communion. This lecture taking place mere weeks before the 2024 U.S. presidential election. The lecture responds to the timely opportunity to explore the complex reality of polarization in American society, and we have some information on that at the entrance. And then our next lecture after that is Thursday, October 24th, and Dr. Elsie Miranda of the Association for Theological Schools joins us for Bridging Empire and Barrio, the Here and the Not Yet of the Kingdom of God. Dr. Miranda offers this lecture as an invitation to discern our personal and collective responsibilities to be the bridge between empire and barrio that makes manifest the kingdom of God in the here and now. And if you want more about that, you can take this flyer. So those next two lectures will be held in the Heights Room on the main campus. Space is filling fast, so be sure to register in advance. Thanks to our speaker for granting us permission to record today's event. As soon as the recording of today's presentation is available for viewing and posted, it will be posted in our Encore archive at bc.edu/encore, and will notify all participants of the availability of the recording. Bookmarks with this information and the web address for Encore is also available at the entrance to this room. Speaking of bookmarks, please be sure to visit the book table out in the hallway. Our speaker's book, Dorothy Day, Radical Devotion, is available for purchase. So during this program, there'll be an opportunity for conversation and for Q&A, and there are 2 points to keep in mind. First, before you ask a question, we ask you to please wait for the microphone so the video can pick it up. One of our CSTM graduate assistants will be circulating with microphones. Many thanks to Isa, Francesca, and Victoria, graduate assistants here at the CSTM, for assisting with this event. And second, please know that if you do ask a question, it will likely be part of the final video and may have a long life. So just be sure you're okay with that before you ask a question. Now I invite Megan DeDios, Director of Continuing Education here at the Boston College Cloud School of Theology and Ministry, to introduce our speaker. Megan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation, Dorothy Day, A Saint for Our Time. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker. Jeffry Odell Korgen is a Catholic writer and comics creator with an over 30-year career in pastoral ministry. He has worked with many Catholic organizations on evaluation and program development and coordinated the local phase of Dorothy Day, Servant of God's canonization process for the Archdiocese of New York. Jeff currently serves as president of Korgen Associates, a consulting firm focusing on coaching, planning, and evaluation. He has worked as an educator and trainer in Catholic social teaching and action, a community organizer, a youth minister, and led a professional association for diocesan social justice directors. Prior to founding his own consulting firm, Jeff served as executive director for diocesan planning for the Diocese of Metuchen in central New Jersey. He's the author of several books, including Solidarity Will Transform the World, Stories of Hope from Catholic Relief Service, My Lord and My God, Engaging Catholics in Social Ministry, Beyond Empowerment, A Pilgrimage with the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and his newest book, Dorothy Day, Radical Devotion, a Graphic Biography. A native of Louisiana, Jeff is a graduate of Boston College with degrees in philosophy, pastoral ministry, and social work, and holds a graduate certificate in canon law from St. Mary's University in Winona, Minnesota. He is a Benedictine Oblate novice at St. Joseph's Abbey in St. Benedict, Louisiana. He lives with his wife, sociologist Kathleen Odell Korgen, in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, and has 2 grown daughters. We're delighted to have him with us this evening today at the Boston College Klaus School of Theology and Ministry. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Korgen.
Thanks, and it's great to be back at Boston College for 2 big reasons. One is I became a Catholic here. I was a Protestant. I was in a mainline church when I lived in Louisiana, and I discovered through the Pulse program the Catholic approach to Scripture, to service, to justice, and it totally changed me. And so I'm really excited to be back here. The other thing is I met Kathleen, who is my wife and my manager tonight. She's got all the change in her pocket. We met at McGuinn Hall, and at the time, there was no microwave oven in the social work lounge. And upstairs in the sociology department, they had a microwave oven. It wasn't as good as the School of Management's microwave. It actually was a what would you call it, analog, where the time wouldn't show up digitally. It was this thing that turned around and around, and it made you feel warm inside when you were near it. So I went up there, and there was a party going on, and I was like, forget my lunch. I'm just going to go to this party before my exam. And so I went, and I was like, oh, there's this cute grad student over there. I'll talk to her. And we got married like 2 years later. So so BC is a very special place for us. Wanted just to talk about Dorothy Day to get started. Are mic runners ready? We're actually going to do something with the mics right away. Our graduate assistants, which I was a graduate assistant at the Institute for Religious Ed and Pastoral Ministry. So my job was driving Tom Groom to the airport for all of his speeches and whatnot. But Dorothy Day, Pope Francis said she's one of 4 great Americans, with like Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln, and all this. And it crashed the Wikipedia site for Dorothy Day because Catholics all over the country said, what, Doris Day? What? She says, nah. So I wanted just to get a sense of, for you all, if you just popcorn style and GAs, if you could run the mic over, who is Dorothy Day? Maybe just say a few things that you know about her. Got one right up here.
She started the Catholic Worker Movement.
Founded the Catholic Worker Movement, right. She would say co-founded with Peter Morin. She was always humble about that. Somebody else?
She converted to become a Catholic?
Yeah, she was born Episcopalian, and her parents really didn't do much with that. And so she was kind of, you might say, spiritual but not religious. But, canonically, she was Episcopalian, and she came into full communion in the church. She actually was rebaptized, which is something they did back in those days, yeah. Anybody else? Go ahead, we got one right there.
She was anti-war.
She was anti-war, right. She had a pacifist belief, and I'll come back to that later. Yeah. Can we get one more? Yeah.
She had a daughter who was never married.
No, her daughter married.
Was she married?
Yeah, that's a longer story, but it's complicated. The guy was a scoundrel, and they may not have been married. We're trying to figure that out. Yeah. No, I can talk about that later. Yeah. Yeah. And she quaintly refers to her common law husband in her writings. They were living together, Anybody else? Maybe one more? Okay, go ahead.
She worked to balance her Catholic faith and also her radical ideas and vision for the world.
Yeah, and that was a source of some pain to her before she figured it out. Yeah, great. So okay, so we're gonna go a little deeper in all this, and just to share how I bumbled into the role of coordinator of the local phase of the canonization process for Dorothy Day. I had this career in social justice, and then I got interested in diocesan administration, so I became a diocesan planner. And one of my jobs was really fun, implementing our synod and these great synod norms that had come out. But part of my other job was merging parishes, which is not fun, but very exciting. Especially if you're working with any national parish, like the personal parishes, with folks who have an experience of communism. That was my most unexpected takeaway, that any group that has an experience of communism really doesn't like you coming in. I'm from the diocese and I'm here to help. That didn't go so well. But one of the things that really made me get a certificate in canon law, which is not a big deal, it kind of qualifies me to make copies for a canon lawyer, but I was so afraid I'd mess up one of these mergers. I was like, I got to get some training in canon law, because if we mess this up, the bishop's not going to be happy. So let's, get me some learning about this. So I had social justice background and canon law, because the sainthood process, it's not like you do a report and you send it to the Vatican and they go, oh, okay, yeah, maybe she should be a saint. It's a trial. And the local phase is all about collecting evidence. And I'll show you the process as we get into it. But let's start with Dorothy Day and her story. A lot of biographies start when she lands in New York, but I like to start it with, the earthquake, the Great San Francisco earthquake. Dorothy Day's father was a journalist, and so they lived in several different places in the country. He was the best sports writer for the most popular sport in the early 20th century. Anyone have a guess what that is? Horse racing, right? He's the first group to get it right. I've been touring a few other places, and baseball. What? So the first sign of trouble was, and this is documented in several books about the earthquake, was the cathedral bells in Chinatown started ringing at 5:12 in the morning. And it just really freaked everybody out. And then, seconds later, the earth opened up. And a lot of fires. Apparently, people got up early in San Francisco, and at 5:15, they had already lit the fires for the day. So most of the city burned down as a result of the earthquake. Meanwhile, back in Oakland, Dad and Mom are awakened by the sound of the earthquake. Dad grabs the two boys. Mom grabs the baby. They get outside and say, "Where's Dorothy?" She got left in the house. She got left behind during one of the greatest disasters in American history. Now, the idea that a person who got left behind in the house during the earthquake would have an affinity for caring for the left behind of our society, not a lot of biographers go into this, but I think it's dead on. So there's if you want to go the formula of a lot of our heroic movies, there's this trauma that's key to, how she turned out. But it's more than the trauma. She also saw the relief efforts, and she noticed that it wasn't big government that came to people's help. It was unions and churches. And there's a famous quote of hers that she asked her mother. They're at a church, and she's seeing all these things happening. She says, "Mother, why can't people treat each other like this all the time?" So we see like the Dorothy Day present at that time. And we did this just for fun. And where's Barbara Allaire? Barbara wrote a children's book about Dorothy Day. And she did the same thing that I did. And I just, after I read her book, I was like, "Barbara, this is going to come out in like 3 years. But I got to tell you, I didn't steal your idea." These are all of the corporal works of mercy. that happened in the context of the earthquake. We thought this would be fun for teachers who use it in their classroom. It's an adult book, but it's accessible to children. So we time jump to 1916. Dorothy arrives in New York City, and she is hungry to become a journalist and to really help working people through her journalism. Her dad was a journalist. Her two brothers are journalists. She wants to be a journalist. Pop says, newspaper is no place for a girl. No place for a girl, which kind of, you wonder what kind of shenanigans he and his colleagues were up to, if he's saying that. But Dorothy lands in New York, and she goes to each of the major papers and asks, I'm looking for a job. I want to help people through journalism. And they all say, newspaper is no place for a girl. And she starts to think maybe Pop, because he was a prominent journalist, maybe Pop had called all these editors because they're saying the exact words that he is. So one thing, though, Pop didn't think about was the socialist papers. He didn't call the socialist papers. So she gets a job with the New York Call, which is one of the famous socialist papers. I think it had a few different cities, and this one was in New York. And this is a little pixelated. I got to get a better picture of that. But she found immediately she was able to get into places that male reporters couldn't. And for example, she interviewed a Italian housewife whose husband was out of work, and he was trying hard to get work, couldn't get it. And she said, okay, well, tell me about your life. And she's saying, I used to cook up chicken feet for the dog, but now we have to eat them ourselves. It's not so bad if you cut the nails off and boil them a long time. And so that turns into an article there on the right bottom. Mr. J.D. Rockefeller, 26 Broadway. Here's a family living on dog food. So you can see it's that whole muckraking tradition. This is early 20th century, and all these papers are trying to grab people with kind of emotional appeal to them. So she ends up having quite a catalog of articles. And there's actually a book that's a collection of those articles. And you really see the Dorothy who becomes Dorothy Day, servant of God, in the commitments there. There's not a religious element, but the social justice element. One of the unfortunate things that happens to her is that a mentally ill colleague at the paper falls in love with her and pesters her, asking her out. And they're at this dance. There used to be these balls that would raise bail money for people who had been arrested for their political views. And if anybody remember the movie Reds in 1980, it won Best Picture. You should check it out if you're interested in Dorothy, because these were her peers. And even some of her colleagues were there, and they show what these balls were like. And so Lewis runs up to Dorothy and tries to give her a hug, and she smacks him right in the face. And this is before her conversion to nonviolence, by the way. And she's like, get out of here, And so she goes into work next day, and her editor is really mad at her. He said, I can't have my reporters hitting each other. You have to apologize to Lewis. And she's saying, why am I the one who has to apologize here? So quickly back, fast forward to Me Too movement. This is sexual harassment in the workplace. And she's being told that she has to apologize. And she says, no, I'm not going to apologize. So her friend Mary Heaton Vorse, who actually owned a house near where we live at Provincetown. If you're ever up on the Cape, you can see her house. She was a very famous writer and allowed the Provincetown Players to use one of her buildings on the wharf. Anyway, she says, hey, Dorothy, why don't you just come work with me at the Masses, which is the one that the main character in Reds, Jack Reed, works at. So this is a very famous paper. So in a way, it's kind of a promotion. And she writes book reviews. She interviews Trotsky after the Russian Revolution. And she has a great career going. But then the U.S. gets into World War I, and saying that the U.S. shouldn't be in this war is called sedition. And it's punishable by throwing you in jail. And if it's serious enough, execution. So her editor says, Dorothy, it's only a matter of time before the government closes us down, because seditious publications will be closed down. And so she says, okay. And he says, well, since you're a woman, I don't think they're going to arrest you. So could you put out the paper if all of us get arrested? And so she does. And she works with the printers and gets the last issue of the Masses out. It's interesting. It has a poem by her, which you can read in the book. And I always wondered, like, did she say, you know what, I'm putting this thing out, I'm going to put my poem in, or was it already supposed to be there? Nobody knows. No one but me has asked this, So I don't know. It's probably what I would do, And so the Masses shuts down. She's unemployed. She's kind of adrift a little bit. And a friend says, hey, Dorothy, I'm going down to Washington to do a demonstration for suffrage for women. You want to come? And she said, sure. Now, Dorothy Day never voted. Pictures from this rally you always see him, Dorothy Day, fighting for suffrage. Well, she never voted. So it's a little bit like many of us, I was a community organizer, and we always say people don't go to events, social justice events, or any other kind of event because they read a notice in the bulletin. They do it because someone they respect invites them. And here we have Dorothy fighting for suffrage, being beaten up by sailors, and eventually thrown into jail. And in jail, she joins a hunger strike, which becomes a very famous thing. And then President Wilson pardons them so that they can go home and cook Thanksgiving dinner for their families. And they're like, pardon us? We committed no crime. And so she gets involved with some new friend groups. She had been really just hanging out with the reporters from the Call and the Masses, and she gets introduced to this bar called the Hellhole in New York, and it's got a lot of literary and radical politically people who drink there, including Eugene O'Neill, playwright. And they become friends. And one of the reasons they become friends is that Eugene O'Neill had this really interesting way of talking about his religious beliefs. He says, I'm an atheist, and I feel pursued by God. Think about that for a minute. It's sort of an acknowledgement of God's existence, but I don't want to be a person of faith. I really don't want to. And so he really liked this poem, The Hound of Heaven, and he would read it at this bar. And that's how they got close, was Dorothy said, wow, I feel pursued by God too. She's in her spiritual but not religious stage and driving some of her colleagues crazy because the editorial cartoonist at the Masses used to say, Dorothy Day would make a terrible communist because she's always cornering you at a party and wanting to talk about God. So they share a love of Dostoevsky, and there's this famous phrase that actually is the title of one of her biographies called A Harsh and Dreadful Love. And that comes from Father Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov, who counsels a woman who's depressed that the way to build your faith is through service. But then he cautions, it's not like la 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 kind of love. That's love in dreams. Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing. And I've met people coming in who do very serious work with people living in poverty, and you know what I'm talking about. It's not always fun. So they become friends, but then their relationship ruptures when Dorothy's sitting at a table with one of her new friends, and he's been dumped by his girlfriend, and he drinks a vial of heroin and dies in her arms. And that's horrible enough. But look at that right panel. They all run. All these people that she's been having a couple of beers, talking about building a better world, talking about being a writer and influencing society, one of their own overdoses, and they all run, except for Dorothy and his sister. So we changed to kind of a blue palette there because she falls into a big depression. And she says, you know what, this literary stuff, maybe it's not the right thing. I'll become a nurse. And that was during that other pandemic, so-called Spanish flu. Spanish flu got the name because Spain was neutral in World War I, and so they didn't censor the press. All the other nations in World War I censored all of this. She falls in love with what I think we might call her fatal attraction, Lionel Moyse, who's a fast-talking journalist, very charismatic. She becomes pregnant, and he says, it's either me or the baby, not the first or the last guy to say that. And she has an abortion, and he's not even there to meet her afterwards like he promised. And she would say to a few confidants late in her life, Lionel told me to choose between him or the baby, and I lost both of them. So this was something that really haunted her, and she never talked about it publicly, except with a couple of Catholic workers who think that she told them so that they could then reveal it after she died. But I always tell, especially students, if you're going to do somebody wrong in love, don't do it to a writer. Because they will write a revenge novel. And she writes this book as a novel called The 11th Virgin. And this is just one quote from it. It's physically impossible for a woman to take a man. She always gives herself up. And now I hate you. I don't want you because I feel everything going out of me to you. The thought of you eats into me continually. Imagine having that written about you, He was kind of a rake, I think you might say. Okay, before we get into Forster, who became the love of her life, this book sold pretty well. The New York Times called it an adolescent novel, but she was very young at the time, so kind of makes sense. But she was approached by a film studio in Hollywood about making a movie out of this book, a silent movie. You can imagine what that was like. And apparently it had no resemblance to the book at all when it was finally made. They kept doing rewrites and rewrites and rewrites until it was just not there. But anyway, she buys a cottage in Staten Island. Her friends say, Dorothy, you go through money like, it's just going to be gone. So buy a house. She buys a cottage on Staten Island, back when Staten Island looked like Cape Cod. It was really a beautiful place. And she meets this fellow Forster who is also politically radical. He's also very much an amateur naturalist and just shows her the wonders of the sea and living in that kind of community. And they have many beautiful shared experiences. And Dorothy is very much in love. She becomes pregnant. And Forster doesn't leave her. He doesn't say have an abortion. They have Tamar. But Dorothy feels so grateful to God. Remember all of her religious urgings. She says, I'm going to join a church now. And I'm going to join the Church of the Poor, the Catholic Church. She joins the Catholic Church. She has her daughter baptized, and then she has herself rebaptized, as they did in those days. And Forster says, I didn't sign up for this. And she said, well, you got to leave then. And so, you think about sacrifices people make for their faith. She said, this is the direction I'm going in. If you're not a part of it, if we're not going to get married, it's not going to work out. And so this is where she really begins to struggle with the old life. She still cares about those issues, but she's got this new spirituality, new religious life as a Catholic. I don't know if this has happened to you, but she says the priests never preach about the poor. They never preach about workers. I've heard so many people say, don't preach about social justice. And here we go. That was one of Dorothy's problems. She didn't even have any Catholic friends at that point. So it was very painful for her, and she struggled. Who said that earlier over here? Yeah, it was really striking when you get into her story, how difficult that was for her. So she leaves the demonstration because it's organized by commies. So she's like, in the previous one, I'm so proud of these men and women. They're fighting for the masses of working people. Part of me wants to be marching with them, but God is pulling me in a new direction. That's a paraphrase of her diary. And she doesn't know what to do. So she goes to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, which I imagine some people here have been to it. Can you raise your hand if you've been to it? I call it the basement church because often groups, when you talk about the crypt, they think it was like dead bodies there and stuff. But in the crypt, she prays because see all the scaffolding, they're building the outside, the upper floors. But the church is open. So she goes down, she prays for guidance from Mary, and then she asks God, "Here I am, Lord. Show me a way to use the gifts you gave me for my fellow workers and the poor." And I just wonder how many of us have been in that situation. Here I am, Lord. You gave me some gifts, but I don't know what to do here. And so she prays, then she gets on a bus and writes a final breakup letter to Forster and goes home. And two things are going on in her apartment. She shares an apartment with her brother and his wife. The first thing is Tamar has the measles. So, she's feeling guilty. She's doing political stuff and her daughter's sick. And then there's this odd Frenchman named Peter Morin there who says, "Let's start a movement. You and me. My ideas and your hard work." Don't do it. Part of me is saying, don't do it. And, you see in the book, he has this very strange style of converting people to his ideas. He just won't stop talking. And, you see there's the doctor taking Tamar's pulse. And Peter says, "And that is why we must fire the bosses." And the doctor's like, "What's going on here?" And we often have him kind of like where his arms are in many different places at the same panel, and because he's so fast talking and gesturing and everything. But Dorothy sees this guy's a little strange, but everything he says makes sense to her. And he says, "Let's start a movement. We'll have a newspaper." And of course, Dorothy's like, "This is what I've wanted to do all my life. I'll be an editor of a newspaper about social justice and this church I just joined." And then the other things, roundtable discussions for the clarification of thought to help workers become scholars, houses of hospitality like those in the Middle Ages, and then farms to grow produce for the houses of hospitality, but also to give people meaningful work. He used to, by 1932, we're in the Depression, he used to say, "There is no unemployment on the land." That is something we always can use our hands and grow food for ourselves. And so he had this whole vision of manual labor during the day and then study and prayer and discussion at night. Who does that sound like? Monks. It sounds like the Benedictines. Yeah. Ora et labora. Prayer and work. And so Peter had been a Christian brother and been kind of exposed to this. And so he wanted to bring it to lay people. So Dorothy's listening to all this. It's like, this guy is saying all the things I want to do. And so she says, "Let's do it." And so right away, you see this little bar graph with bundles of newspapers. The newspaper starts out with a circulation of 20,000. 5 years later, in 1938, it's 190,000 because this is hitting a nerve with people of faith. The Catholic Church, priests and bishops are scared that the faithful are going to become communists and are also concerned about the suffering of people living in poverty. And Dorothy and Peter have come up with this way to channel the dissatisfaction with society. And it really catches on. And one of the initial supporters, of the Catholic worker, kind of bankrolling, getting beds for the houses and that kind of thing, is the Sisters of Bethany. Anyone ever heard of them, Sisters of Bethany? At the time, they were called reformed prostitutes. Today, we would call them human trafficking survivors. They are women who had been caught up in prostitution and had escaped the pimps and gone into religious life. And they thought Dorothy would be a great person to send women that they had freed from prostitution as kind of a safe house. So they did a lot of building of the infrastructure in the early days. Dorothy covered a lot of strikes. Peter didn't like this. He would say, "Strikes don't strike me." You did way with words. It's very interesting being, English as a second language. He had this amazing ability with puns with the English language. And so this is page 1, July 1937. And this is what happens when you go on strike in the city of Chicago. The police beat you up and shoot you in the back. And so she was covering that. She was bringing that to a church audience. In the 1950s, she got involved with the civil rights movement. She went to Koinonia Farm, which was an interracial community down in Georgia, Americus, Georgia. And she did a shift at night with another member of the community to just be on toes of being attacked by people that didn't like the fact that they were an interracial community. And Dorothy got shot at. If she hadn't ducked when the other woman said duck, she'd be a martyr for civil rights. She and this woman stayed up for hours during the night. This woman, I forget her name, she's a Baptist, and she taught Dorothy Baptist hymns and brought her accordion along for the accompaniment. And Dorothy taught her Liturgy of the Hours. So it's kind of a neat exchange, and of course it was very harrowing later. They had asked her not to do a sight on the watch because they knew something like this might happen. So a lot of travel, and she would leave Tamar in the care of people in the movement that she trusted. And I was just so relieved when we went through all this that she was a good judge of character in doing that. So, there's one to death row in Philadelphia, to Yale Law School, to lecture, working with Catholic worker houses that are dedicated to a particular ministry, like to dying children. And then, of course, in the civil rights movement, she did a lot with sharecroppers in Mississippi, a lot of writing so that Catholics all over the country could know what was happening there. A little bit of conflict, just want to make sure we mentioned that, didn't always get along with Cardinal Spellman in New York. They got in a big fight because Cardinal Spellman, the cemetery workers said, "You know what? Could we work 5 days a week instead of 6 days a week? Have a 5-day work week?" And he said, "No way, and you're all a bunch of communists, and you're all fired." And so, very creative solution, he brought in scabs who were seminarians. So the seminarians were digging the graves in December and things like that. And a friend of mine, Tom Dobbins from the Archdiocese of New York, he's the social justice director now. Years ago, like about 2000, he met a 90-year-old priest who was one of these guys digging graves, and they did not appreciate it. You go to study theology and you're digging graves in the cold because he thinks the workers are communists. They ultimately did settle it. The guys came back. They had to get a new union to kind of meet him halfway with that. But they still had to work 6 days a week. They got a little bit of a raise. But as we get to the latter part of this, I just wanted to say Dorothy, while she did very dramatic things, and that was what really pulled me into this, where I said, reading stuff like this drama is amazing. Like this would make a great musical, and then before Kathleen had a chance to tell me that I'm not Lin-Manuel Miranda, I was saying, like, darn it, I don't have any skills in that area, but I'd done some comics and on worker justice issues and on immigration. And I thought, well, through art and words, Dorothy was always very, very interested in art, literature, poetry. This might be a way to tell her story in a new way. But I had to just have a panel of just cutting carrots, because with all that drama, the saintliest thing she did was stick to it. When, things got hard, when it was a harsh and dreadful love, she just kept at it. And that's a beautiful thing. And we just had the feast of Saint Therese, right, of the Little Way. And that was the way that Dorothy lived. Into the Vietnam War, you may have remembered there were 4 people who burned their draft cards in Union Square, and that started the whole burn draft card. 2 of them were Catholic workers. So by this time, Dorothy was really more of a mentor of the people that did the actions. She smoked way too long in her life and had an enlarged heart, so her health wasn't that great in the later years. Can't talk about the 70s without talking about the hippies. They drove her crazy. She was saying they don't do anything. They just come here and sponge off us. And Stanley Wisniewski, who was a really, really funny guy and so loyal to Dorothy, he at 17, he said, I saw an old lady carrying a typewriter across the street, and I went to help her, and that's how I got involved in the Catholic work. Dorothy was 35 at that time. And he says, now we've always had freeloaders at the Catholic Shirker. And then she says, but Stanley, they didn't use drugs and get the girls pregnant. They're as bad as those beats in the 1950s. She really didn't like the hippies, but she was anti-war. And so, Abby Hoffman called her the first hippie, but she would be greatly insulted by that. She does one last action. You've probably seen pictures of this, where she's, the sheriff's deputies with their big guns are all around her, and she's this frail old woman in a cane chair. She hung out with Mother Teresa whenever Mother Teresa was in town. They had a very close relationship. Although some of the guests would do things like, got a cigarette? And Mother Teresa says, no, I don't smoke. Then what good are you? That really happened. Several witnesses that are still alive. And then, where is Father Jim Keenan here? All right, Father Jim, can somebody get Father Jim a mic? We have someone who had a close encounter with Dorothy Day, and it's a great story.
Thank you. So I'm a novice at the time. It's 1971, and I'm up at Lemoyne College. And she was invited to give a lecture, and the lecture was on saints of our day. And it was on Julius Nyeri, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Cesar Chavez. And packed house. She was up there in part because the Berrigan brothers were raised there in Syracuse, and the mother, Frida, whom we used to go to her nursing home to sing to, she wanted to be up there. But it was also because there was a Jesuit in the year ahead of me, Alex Avitabili, who really followed her a great deal and was promoting her. And so he campaigned on the campus. So there were about 1,500 people in this one hall to listen to her speak. And she said she was going to speak on saints and eros in our day. And nobody knew what on earth this could mean, saints and eros in our day. She began the lecture by simply saying that her assistant or her secretary, I forget which, but it was kind of an exaggeration, meaning herself, she said, made a typo. It's saints and heroes in our day. No one knew whether that's why the room was so full. But the big thing that happened was I was in a group of undergraduates who were activists on campus, and we were hosting a luncheon at this place called International House. And they decided that for lunch with her, we should have tofu burgers. This was 1971. Hardly anyone knew what a tofu burger was. And I simply raised the question, like, why? And they said, because she's a saint, and therefore she has to be a vegetarian. And I said, well, I presume she's a saint, but do you know if she's a vegetarian? And they didn't like that at all. And so I ended up sitting next to her at lunch, and she opens up a sandwich and she says, "What is this?" I said, "It's a tofu burger." And she said, "What?" I said, "It's a tofu burger." She said, "Why are we having tofu burgers?" I said, "Because you're a saint. And because since you're a saint, you have to be a vegetarian." And she said, "I hate when they do this." And I said, "I do too." And then I said, "Would you like a ham sandwich?" And she said, "I would love a ham sandwich." So I took her away from the luncheon and brought her to the novitiate. And we had lunch together, her and I having a ham sandwich. But I stayed up with her afterwards. But that was a nice introduction. Thank you.
Beautiful story. And it gets us to... It gets us to Dorothy's most famous quote, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily," which, people, how people change quotes, to fit what they're trying to say. People often say, "Don't make me a saint." She wasn't talking about the future. She was talking about the present. Time magazine had just had a cover story on living saints. Guess who was on the cover? Mother Teresa. Dorothy is in the B level, living saints in the interior. But Dorothy got that, and people used to say, the reporter at this May 8th, 1974 lecture, she was asked by a reporter, "How does it feel to be a living saint?" She was like, "Get out of here." She's on, and she said, sarcastic remark, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily." And apparently that is her most famous quote now. So if you are the sarcastic bent, you need to realize one of your comments may be the thing you remembered forever for. I had a student at University of San Diego last week. I did that thing of like, "What do you know about Dorothy?" She said, "Don't call me a saint." I said, "Okay, anything else?" "No, that's all I remember." That's what's happening now. I just want to finish up with that bottom panel. Dorothy's opening a letter right after this encounter with Father Keenan. She's back at the house and she's opening up the mail and she says, "Another award? What are we doing wrong?" Which one of her friends who's still alive told that story. So I'm just going to briefly go through the sainthood process. You probably know a lot about this, that you don't just go from being a candidate servant of God to being a saint. There's these levels. And the first level, venerable, is the part that I worked 7 years on. It's collecting the evidence of a life of heroic virtue. And once you get that, venerable doesn't mean old. It means worthy of being venerated. So it's like a churchy word that then became kind of a secular word that was a different meaning. So then you need either martyrdom or a first miracle to become blessed or be beatified, or to be canonized or become a saint, you need a second miracle or the first for a martyr. So my role is to coordinate 35 people who knew her giving testimonies, answers questions. 2 theologians review all published writings. This is one of the great journalists of the 20th century, had her own newspaper. It's a lot of stuff. All diaries and letters of import transcribed and submitted. We submitted 100 letters. Where's Billy? Father Billy? Father Billy? Brother Billy? Okay, Billy. Okay, so Billy was one of our transcribers. We had 10,000 pages of diary. We had about, those letters, maybe another 1,000 pages. And we had to transcribe all of it for the Vatican. And that's hard. Her handwriting is terrible. Anybody who tells you like in the olden days you had good handwriting, it might be true if you go back to the Civil War, but it was not true in the early 20th century. Her handwriting's awful. And Billy was part of a team. We had 125 people around the world transcribing her diaries and letters. Then testimonies of current bishops to say, okay, these are the folks running the church now. Like, what do they think of Dorothy? And then additional supportive material, which we don't have time to go deep into, but I'll just quickly share. Where is it? There's a character in Batman based on her. Her name is Dr. Leslie Tompkins. There was a Batman writer who hung out at the Catholic Worker, and he felt like himself being changed and becoming a pacifist. Meanwhile, he's writing one of the more violent comics available in the 1970s. And they're trying to get out of that silliness of the TV show. You know, some folks remember, no, Batman. That it made a lot of money for DC Comics, but it kind of ruined the character because he became a joke. Instead of somebody who watched his parents being murdered and traumatized by that, he becomes a crime fighter. I mean, that's dark stuff. And so this writer, Denny O'Neil, kind of his job was to bring Batman into a darker place, but he created a character that would be the conscience of Batman. And he based her on Dorothy Day. And, Batman saying, you and those like you're the hope of Crime Alley. Maybe the only hope our tormented civilization has left. That's Denny O'Neil talking to Dorothy Day, as much as Batman talking to his mentor. And this has less evidence behind it, but you'll see when people tell the story, they say, it is said that a Star Trek episode was based on Dorothy Day. And you look at it, and it kind of is. It's actually a little bit of a critique. The Enterprise goes through some kind of space-time anomaly, and they get to this planet that looks a lot like Earth. And they go down there, and Nazis are controlling it. Because apparently there was this pacifist that started a movement to prevent the U.S. to get into World War II. And as a result, the Nazis control the whole world. And so it's a bit of a critique in a way. It's really like it's a just war kind of message. But the fact that they chose Dorothy and cast Joan Collins playing her is a bit of a tribute. And then just to finish up, there is a lot of legacy in Dorothy. There's all these Catholic worker houses all over the world. There's one in Uganda, one in the Philippines, all over the states of the United States. And then there's also ideas of her that caught on. And she wasn't the only one promoting worker-owned businesses or land trusts, but she did, because they had this idea that was popular in the 50s called distributism. And the whole idea is that capitalism, fine, make capitalism our economic system, but shouldn't the people doing the work get more of the wealth that's created? And so worker-owned businesses, like you take home health aides that work in worker-owned businesses are not in poverty. Those who work for someone else are in poverty. And that's true for many, many businesses. And that's just some pictures of some of those folks. And then this is the last slide. There's a little epilogue in the book. After telling Dorothy's story, I do 5 pages on the sainthood cause. So you can kind of learn a little bit about some of the things that happened there. A lot of weird stuff. And I just kind of created this idea that I had a nightmare about it, where the sainthood process was a game and different things, like Vatican. We had spent a year and a half copying Dorothy's publications. And the question, one-sided or two-sided copies? Well, a lot of thoughts, see it come out, and, two-sided would be the way to go. We finally get a canon lawyer, and he says, no, it has to be all single-sided. So we have to go back and copy all those things. And then, by the way, it has to be on A4 paper, because that's what they use in Europe. And so we're like, so this is all built around their convenience, right? Not ours. And we're thinking like, how, I know about some candidates for sainthood from Rwanda. Like, how do they do all this? So I'm not here to tell you that the canonization process is perfect, but I ended up kind of feeling like it's the best thing we got, that it does take a long time and that it allows you to get to the truth. And that was, we all took oaths to get to the truth. It wasn't fan-based, like I wasn't a member of the Catholic Worker, but I was in social justice movements. I understood Dorothy and so forth. So I always, my daughters would ask me, like, if you find out something bad about her, would you hide it? And I said, no, I took an oath to tell the truth. And what a crummy victory that would be, getting something canonized where you knew something really bad about them, So I'm going to stop there and ask folks to turn to the person next to you, and it's okay if it's a group of 3, whatever. And I'm going to throw 2 questions at you. One is, what was most interesting to you in what I shared? There's lots more in the book, but these are kind of some of the interesting things. And what would you like to learn more about? Because there's just so many dimensions to this. So why don't we take about 5 minutes, and we'll look.
Hello, I enjoyed your talk, thank you. Since it's a pivotal thought of yours, what age was she when she got left behind in that fire?
Let's see, Dorothy is interesting. She's very much a 20th century life. She's born in 1897, and she died in 1980. And she was 8 or 9 years old, probably 8. No, yeah, 8, because her birthday's in November. So yeah, she was 8 years old.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so she has memories of it.
And thank you. And who was the fourth person that Francis said was one of the four
Great Americans.
foremost great Americans?
Yeah, Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton. So there's another churchy. It was sort of like two, well, yeah, Martin Luther King's churchy too, but 2 Catholics and 2 non-Catholics, I guess. Yeah. Yes, over here.
Hi. Outside of social justice circles, like for example, at the school I went to for undergrad, I would talk about my involvement with the Catholic Worker or my interest in Dorothy Day, and they would always say, "Oh, isn't she that woman who had an abortion?" And it's like her whole life has been reduced to this single event, and I just think that's really unfortunate. I had never really heard anything beyond just what you have shared, so I'm curious. I know that the church is very, anti-abortion, so on and so forth, rightfully so. But I just think that kind of minimizing her life to that is an injustice to her work and the Catholic Worker Movement. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, as maybe come time for her to be the patroness of X, Y, and Z. I've already seen some things that it's, life after abortion. And I'm like, oh, but there's so much more there. So
Yeah, right. And that's come up a lot with the Guild of particularly, I mean, it's sort of like with any famous person, is people using that person's life to promote whatever they want, and with Dorothy, I think it was Cardinal O'Connor and maybe a little bit of Cardinal Egan. But what happened was Cardinal O'Connor started the cause and then died like the next day. I mean, literally. He got out of his deathbed, flew to Rome, asked the Pope. He had 3 wishes. One wish was that his priest secretary, would be made an auxiliary bishop. The second was that Dorothy would be put on the track to sainthood, because he had done all the paperwork years earlier and it just sat there. And the third thing was that Edward Egan would not be his successor. And I think, I wasn't there, but I think basically Pope said, "I'll give you 2 out of 3. So he always said, O'Connor, in the time before he died, that she would make a great patron for women who have had abortions. And that really freaked out a lot of people in the Catholic Worker Movement, because it's not to deny all of that, but she didn't make it part of her public persona. And it was really something that haunted her till the day she died. So it would be a real mistake. Now, other things that are brewing in that area of, well, what's Dorothy going to be remembered for? I'll just go back to one great American, Martin Luther King Jr. We have this holiday, right? And I remember when our kids were in elementary school, they'd come home and said, "Oh, it's Martin Luther King. Oh, what'd you do? Oh, we picked up trash in a park." And I said, "Okay, what was that all about?" He said, "Because Martin Luther King believed in service." I'm thinking, that's all they're learning about Martin Luther King, that he believed in picking up trash? Like there's a way in which a person, and this is Dorothy, saying, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily." That she didn't want people to say, "Oh, isn't it great that Dorothy Day did all this stuff with the poor and all that? It's great that people like her are around, so I don't have to do it," is what's implied. But the business of what she will be remembered for, I find that there are certain people that just talk about her direct service of the poor or people living in poverty. And they don't talk about her absolute commitment to pacifism to the point that she opposed World War II. And in a parallel universe, the Nazis control the earth now because of that. You know, no one's talking about that when they go on and on about poverty, which is great what she did. She's also, Dorothy Day opposed Social Security. She was an anarchist. She was a Christian anarchist. She did not believe she thought the role of government was picking up trash and making sure dogs didn't bite you. You know, that was her sense of the role of government. It's actually one of the few beliefs she had that's actually different than official Catholic teaching. It's on the role of government, that she had a much more anarchist view. And back to I saw this, did anyone remember the Christopher Close-Up show? It was on Sunday mornings, and they would have these interviews, and Dorothy was on one time. You can watch it on YouTube. There's a lot of nice YouTube videos where she's, you know, being interviewed. And she was talking about poverty. She said, you know, these people that think the government should be giving them money, it's just terrible. She had my attention, and then she said, unions and churches should be helping people living in poverty, not the government. And she said, if every family, if every homeowner had a room in their house called a Christ room that they would have homeless people stay in, there would be no homelessness. You know, she had this radical call. That's why we call it radical devotion, that a lot of really conservative bishops like, because she's saying, you know, do what Jesus said. Don't wait for the government to do it for you. Do it. So she opposed Social Security, the most effective anti-poverty program our country has ever had. So there are ways in which she's a little different. And so will she become the patron of people who hate the government? You know, like what? No, seriously, like there are things. If she gets elevated to venerable, if she is seen as having lived a life of heroic virtue, which means, did she live prudence heroically? Did she live temperance heroically? Did she live fortitude heroically? That's what this trial is all about. Did she live a life of heroic virtue? Now, from that, what's she going to be remembered for? And think about, if she becomes venerable, it's going to start becoming commonplace to have her in sidebars in Catholic religion textbooks. Now, what do they say? Do they talk about the houses of hospitality, but not the farms and not the nonviolence? You know, how's that going to go? And so there are several people, I won't say many, but there are several key people who knew Dorothy, who are in the Catholic Worker, who say, no way. She should not be made a saint because she'll be co-opted. Guaranteed. And my response is always, only if we let them. That this is an organizing effort. People who know Dorothy need to sit down with the major publishers of religion textbooks and talk about how complex this story is. And then they figure out how to make that developmentally appropriate. So, great question. Yes, sir. Father.
I know you were on the Servant of God track.
Oh, maybe we should move away from this one.
There you go. And I was curious, when it comes to the blessed element, how difficult is it to prove the miraculous, and how broad of a spectrum do they use when it comes to the miracles, or do they rely on people's prayers and intercessions? And, you know I grew up in Brockton, and St. Edith Stein, one of her miracles was a young boy, they prayed through the intercession of St. Edith Stein that he would recover from a Tylenol overdose. And he was from Brockton, and that's why they named the church St. Edith Stein, because he grew up in that parish, and that was one of the miracles.
Wow.
So is it praying through the intercession of Dorothy Day, Servant of God?
Yeah, God grants the miracle, but through the intercession of the person you pray to. And I think you're bringing up a great question about, well, what's a miracle, right? Is the U.S. ice hockey win in the Olympics, you know, like, do you believe in miracles? You know, like, are those miracles? Are they provable? Just go back to the legal part. And it seems as if these days only medical miracles are proven in a court of law church law, canon law, only medical miracles. And so what we call those other things is graces and favors. Like, for example, and this is not a joke. Anyone ever lived in New York City before? Okay, a few folks. We had a New Yorker send in a miracle. I prayed to Dorothy Day that I would find a free parking spot in Manhattan, and I did. And I only kind of partially think that was a joke. Like, I think the person felt like, this is amazing. I prayed to Dorothy, and there it is. I would have to pay $50 over there for an hour, and now I got this free. And so we call those graces and favors. Those are things that are unprovable. And sometimes people ask, well, what about the miracles that have been turned in? And I was there for 7 years, so these would come in from time to time, and I really didn't think any of them were miracles. But there was one that came in that, I had a tumor, and I prayed to Dorothy that it would go away, and by the time they did the biopsy the next week, it was gone. Like, oh, that sounds provable, scans and all that. And so I'm getting all excited, like thinking 3 moves ahead, And then the guy says, does it matter that I also prayed to Sister Thea Bowman? I think, yes, it matters. Because how can you prove this thing that's hard to prove to begin with? But then you say, well, I prayed, I thought the odds were kind of against me, so I prayed to a lot of people. People do that, and then you can't use their miracle. And the Vatican is also, I guess they've been embarrassed by some of the cancer miracles because, somebody dies like 2 months after it's declared a miracle that they're healed of the cancer. So now they say you have to be cancer-free for 7 years before they'll look at cancer miracles. But something like the tumor vanishing, the overdose of Tylenol, those are medical miracles that you can just do right away. Okay, why don't you get the mic so everyone can hear it?
So my question is, why do you choose the title Radical Devotion? I mean, the radical I can quite understand, but devotion, what do you mean by devotion in this context?
Well, that her devotion to God led to this incredible lifestyle that, it's such a radical life in the sense of, I'm thinking of Chesterton saying, it's not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting, it's that Christianity has been found difficult and left untried. That here was somebody who tried to live according to the Beatitudes. Jesus says, I was hungry and you gave me food. Well, give people food until it runs out. Live that way. Blessed are the peacemakers. Then don't participate in war. Don't pay the taxes that pay for war. That devotion to the teachings of Jesus and to the social teachings of the church is radical. Yeah. So that's how we came up with the title.
Hi. Hi. Thank you so much for coming. I was wondering, so you mentioned the San Francisco earthquake as a part of the story that often gets left out.
Yeah.
In all your research, is there any other stories that maybe you didn't mention in the book, or maybe that you did, that are often forgotten about Dorothy Day's story that you maybe like to share with us today?
Well, I had this issue where I had to raise money to prepay for the art. Like, comics are expensive, and so fortunately, Christopher was willing to work for a reduced page rate, and he would get half the royalties from the book. So we worked out that where it's kind of like I was kind of thinking of, that story about Sir Alec Guinness in Star Wars, where he was a famous actor doing like really good stuff. And there's this cheesy science fiction thing. Sorry if I'm offending anybody, but it's not great literature, and he's kind of like, do I do this or not? And he said, you know what? Why don't I work for a percentage just in case this is a big hit? And so this guy who lived the starving artist life was, incredibly rich when he died. And so he got to enjoy some of that. So it's expensive to do comics. And so we had to start with, okay, we're going to have, it would be like if this was a 4-part Netflix series. What would we cover in one chapter? What would we cover in another chapter? What we cover, and so we came up with these 4 different areas. You know, the first chapter is called Dorothy Day, Girl Reporter, and it's set in that time. You know, and she goes through her radical period, becomes Catholic, breaks up with Forster, and that's that first one. Then we time jump. So we're already leaving a bunch of stuff out, but we time jump to that 1932. And that's sort of the origin of the Catholic worker part. But then it's like her most prolific time was the 1950s. And she did these brilliant, we didn't cover it here, but it's in the book. New York City had a law that when the air raid sirens went off, you had to duck and cover. You know, you had to go down to the subways or other fallout shelters. I mean, in my day at BC, people would have these fallout shelter signs that they would put up in their rooms. You know, they'd steal it from somewhere. In those days, they were for real. You were supposed to drop everything you did and go to this fallout shelter. And so Dorothy came up with a brilliant nonviolent resistance. She called them rehearsals for doomsday. And she said, you know what? We're going to have a picnic. So they would go to a park and have a picnic when the air raid sirens went off, and that was their protest. And in the beginning, there was like 20 people arrested, and by the end, there were thousands of people at this. And people were it just became like a joke, like a dark joke about those duck and cover drills. So that was something that we put in. Things we didn't put in, you know, there's a Dorothy Day movie called Entertaining Angels, and it's a good movie, but it's kind of like Abraham Lincoln. Like, you got 2 hours, what are you going to cover? Some people have really, you know, like all these biographies of Abraham Lincoln, people are thinking of new things to write about him all the time because it was such an interesting life, and Dorothy's is like that. So it's sort of like the end to, is it Matthew's Gospel or John's, where it says, you know, if we were to write all the things that Jesus did, it would fill all the books in the world, you know? Like, it's kind of like that with Dorothy. What I'm hoping for is an 8-part Netflix series where we can really unpack this, produced by Angel Studios, you know? We'll work on it. Yes. Oh, and let's get you a microphone.
Maybe I missed it, but did you say anything about, did she love Peter Morin? Did she marry? She didn't marry him, I guess, but did they live together as man and wife?
No. Peter Morin, it was interesting, you know, because like with Eugene O'Neill, it was the same thing. It was a non-sexual friendship, you know, that with Peter, he was a bit older, and I don't know how marriageable he was with his style of communication. You know, I don't know too many women that would enjoy being around someone who's constantly indoctrinating them into their thinking. So yeah, it was platonic, but she loved him, yeah, in the sense of really caring about him and really appreciating. You know, he showed up, and one of the things he pointed out that really hit home for a critique, he's like, you know the scriptures, but you don't know anything about Catholic teaching, and you don't know anything about the saints. And she was like, oh yeah, that's kind of true. Like, I brought my minimal Christian upbringing with me from the Episcopal Church, but encyclicals of the popes, Rerum Novarum, you know, talking about workers, she needed to dive into that, and Peter was the person who taught her that. Yeah. We got in the back there.
Thank you for speaking with us tonight. Where did your interest in Dorothy Day start?
Yeah, I don't know if folks know, you know, Bono, the singer from U2, said that about Christianity. He said, I'm a fan, but I'm not in the band. So I was like that with Catholic Worker. Like, it just wasn't something that called to me. And also, you know, if you read my book on Catholic Relief Services, I went to Rwanda and met with people who had forgiven the people that killed their families. And if the United States had intervened, 800,000 people wouldn't have died. And so for me, I tend to be kind of like a strict just war person. So absolute pacifism wasn't there for me. But I liked reading Dorothy Day because she challenged me so much. I think there's challenges for everybody. You know, like for people on the left, there's this whole thing about government. We should be helping people through other means, you know, like the church. And so with Dorothy, for me, she challenged me around how I was relating to people living in poverty, because I was always one of those people that said, well, you work at the soup kitchen, but I'm working on public policy, you know, or I'm the lead organizer for the Brockton Interfaith community back in the late 90s. And I realized reading Dorothy that I wasn't a personalist. That's her. She and Peter coined that expression, which means that you are really, when you're talking to a homeless person, you're looking into their eyes and you're seeing Jesus. You're seeing a human being made in the image and likeness of God. You're not just handing things out or doing work that's going to reduce poverty. No, you are working with a human being. And that changed the way, you know, just living in the New York area for 25 years and working with the Archdiocese, there's no limit to how many homeless people you might encounter. And I started taking the time. I started leaving earlier for work so I could actually have conversations. And it really was good for me. So in a way, I felt like I was like Herod, you know, where, you know, Herod said about John the Baptist that he was greatly disturbed by his teaching, but he liked to listen to him. And I think like, yeah, that was kind of like me and Dorothy, you know, and she does challenge you. Like I had a spiritual director, I was talking about this to him. He says, yeah, you know, I have a painting of her in my room. And every day I wake up, I look at her and I say, there she is staring me down. Because she's saying, you call yourself a Christian? Well, do it, you know? So I think we have time for one more. Yes.
Thanks so much for tonight. I have a question. I wanted to read a quote of hers first, if that's okay with you. One that I've used for a number of talks that I've given, particularly in the youth ministry space. We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. I found, particularly in youth ministry, at least with the generation that's coming up today, loneliness and disconnection, isolation seems to be on the rise. And every time I've spoken to young people about Dorothy Day, and of course she has all these incredible things that she's done, but what strikes young people particularly is this concept of community. So I wonder, in what you've found, and I've only had a limited sort of encounter of her in the things that I've read, what could she teach us today about community when it comes to the witness of God's love in the chaos of the world?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll mention that poem that she wrote, it comes at the end of The Long Loneliness. You know, we were just sitting there talking. We use that in the book as she's dying and kind of reviewing her whole life. And it's just so perfect for that, because it sums up her whole community of Catholic worker. And I think probably the most important thing, because there's so many Catholic authors and ministers who have talked about the importance of community. For Dorothy, the community included the people they were helping. So it's not that, okay, these sisters live in community and serve the poor. It's that she and her friends are living in community with the poor, and in some ways, you know, living different lives, but in some ways finding commonalities. And one thing I really appreciate about the Catholic worker, and we did this with someone who died in the cause, they do obituaries of overlooked people. And Dorothy wrote many of these herself, where there would be like a guest who had stayed for 10 years and then died. And Dorothy would write the obituary, and it became like a tradition. And there's even a book that collects different obituaries of people that would have been forgotten. And so it's really a beautiful thing. But it's the idea of where do you draw the lines of the community? You know, it's a little like, who is my neighbor? You know, well, let's take that a step further. Who's my housemate? You know, so that's, you know, talk about radical. I mean, that's, and I love the way you use that. And just a final comment, people know David Brooks, the columnist. He teaches a spiritual autobiography class at Yale. And they do like 8 different, spiritual autobiographies from different times, different places and all that. And he says, the assignment at the end of the semester is to write a paper about one of the people they encountered. 75% of the students write on Dorothy Day. So I think your point, what you're intuiting, is people all over the country and all over the world keep finding this out for themselves. Dorothy Day, when you look at her as a young adult, it's like she went from one different community to the next, trying to find a place for herself. I'm in the radical group, I'm in the literary group, I'm doing this. It's sort of like high school in a way, And then she finds it. It's the Catholic worker, and God led her to that. So I appreciate you mentioning that, because it is really important. Quickly. Yeah, in the back. Because all the cars turn into pumpkins at 7, so that's what they tell me.
Thank you so much for coming. I just had one quick question. Because you mentioned Dorothy Day's anarchist views, so I was wondering, was she ever arrested at any time point in her life?
Oh, yeah, and it was really fun when our canon lawyer heard this, that she had been arrested 6 times, once for prostitution, which was a total frame-up. She was in a radical house, and there's this term in the law in Chicago, being found in a disorderly house, which means being found in a brothel, and it was International Workers of the World House. But yeah, she was arrested 5 times, and she has about a 400-page FBI file, which we sent to the Vatican, along with 2/3 of a ton of other evidence. So I'll be sticking around. We'll be selling books at the table, signing them and so forth. And let's just end with this prayer. And please, if you have any graces or favors or miracles to report, let the Dorothy Day Guild know about it. Just go to dorothydayguild.org. All right, well, let's begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And let's say together, God, our Father, your servant Dorothy Day exemplified the Catholic faith by her life of prayer, voluntary poverty, works of mercy, and witness to the justice and peace of the gospel of Jesus. May her life inspire your people to turn to Christ as their Savior, to see his face in the world's poor, and to raise their voices for the justice of God's kingdom. I pray that her holiness may be recognized by your church, and that you grant the following favor that I humbly ask through her intercession. I ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you.